From the beginning of the Southern invasion, all battlefronts in France really became one, and all plans, both tactical and logistical, were devised upon the assumption that soon the whole would constitute one continuous order of battle.
The plan called for an Allied landing on the Mediterranean French coast between Toulon and Caen. The whole coastal area, extending from the beaches inland for about 150 miles, was thoroughly softened up for the assault troops. For 3.5 months preceding the invasion date, 5,000 Allied planes dropped some 12,500 tons of bombs on southern France. Early on the morning of August 15, 1944, the mounting air bombardment was supplemented by strong naval fire against the beaches. Soon after dawn on the same morning, the invasion troops prepared for the trip to shore. There was as yet no hint of enemy resistance. Spearheaded by 3 American divisions, supplemented by French units, the U.S. 7th Army made the assault. The troops, many of them veterans of the North African and Italian campaigns, stormed ashore at 8 a.m. and met very light opposition. The landing was executed exactly as planned. The enemy was caught by surprise. The American and French assault units, once ashore, were opposed by only 2 German divisions, spread along the coast, and 8 more farther inland. 7th Army troops won a 15-mile-wide beachhead with comparative ease, and the operation was considered an overwhelming success by Allied field commanders. With the beachhead securely ours, the drive inland was begun without delay. The course of the advance was to be up the valley of the Rhone River. The troops started their drive toward the valley against stiffening resistance. The assault forces were helped materially by members of the French underground, as well as by French villagers encountered along the path of the advance. During the first few days of the campaign, the 7th Army and the Maquis captured more than 10,000 Nazi troops. Throughout the Allied drive in southern France, the Maquis played an especially active and extremely valuable part. The southern France invasion force was to fight its way up the Rhone Valley and then swing eastward into Germany. Having overcome the Nazi defenders along the coast, the 7th Army pushed up the valley on the heels of the main body of German forces racing north toward the German frontier. The pursuit was speeded up in an attempt to trap the fleeing Nazis. The Air Force pounded the exposed German columns steadily. At intervals, the Allied chase was slowed down, as the 7th Army troops were called upon to reduce a pocket of Nazi resistance. The GIs went about the job quickly and efficiently. first 2 weeks of the campaign in southern France, thousands of Nazis were killed and 50,000 captured. After 10 days of fighting, the Allied force reached the Rhone River itself at Montelimar, 100 miles from the landing beaches. Here, a last-ditch Nazi stand was quickly beaten down. The advancing Americans trapped one Nazi panzer division and elements of 2 other German divisions. The Germans lost great quantities of materiel in their unsuccessful defense at Montelimar, and additional thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured in the brief but savage battle. In town after town in their victorious drive up the Rhone Valley, the GIs were greeted with enthusiasm by the overjoyed French townspeople. On September 11th, junction was made between the southern France assault force and American units which had entered France from the Atlantic coast. In the Dijon area, the U.S. 7th and 3rd Army troops made contact, and western France was sealed off. For the final push to the German frontier, the Allies presented a single powerful battle line. Sparking the drive to the east was Patton's 3rd Army.
Patton realized that through speed and determination, each successive advantage is more easily and economically gained than the previous one. Relentless and speedy pursuit is the most profitable action in war.
But the Germans did not simply fall back. The Nazis showed every intention of fighting savagely for every mile of eastern France still in their hands. They used all available mobile equipment in their strong effort to stem the Allied advance along the whole battle line. In a concerted attempt to stabilize their defense, the Nazis fought stubbornly, fully aware that if this stand were unsuccessful, the Allies would, before long, penetrate into Germany itself. In their determined defense, they used their newest, most improved weapon. The Allies hammered continuously at the Nazi line, which had stiffened abruptly. The Allied attack was not quite strong enough. Though handicapped by lengthening supply lines, the Allies kept up their attack on all sections of the front in an all-out drive toward the German frontier. The battle continued for weeks during the early autumn. Elements of Patton's 3rd Army advanced the Allied position a little closer to the German Siegfried Line as they crossed the Meuse River.
We were certain that by continuing an unremitting offensive, we would, in spite of hardship and privation, gain additional advantages over the enemy. Specifically, we were convinced that this policy would result in shortening the war, and therefore in the saving of thousands of Allied lives. Consequently, the fall period was to become a memorable one because of a series of bitterly contested battles, usually conducted under the most trying conditions of weather and terrain. The fighting throughout the front, from Switzerland to the mouth of the Rhine, descended during the late fall months to the dirtiest kind of infantry slugging. Advances were slow and laborious. Gains were ordinarily measured in terms of yards rather than miles. Operations became mainly a matter of endurance, stamina, and courage. Because of depletion of their infantry strength, divisions quickly exhausted themselves in action. Our offensive strength fell off markedly. During the 3 months beginning September 1st, I spent a great portion of my time in travel. I visited commanders in their own headquarters, kept personal touch with problems as they arose, and above all, gained a feel of the troops.
All along the front, Allied planes kept up the attack on Nazi defensive positions. American troops advanced yard by yard in the drive to push the enemy back within his own borders.
The French First Army led the attack on the Falaise Gap and breached it within a week. Its leading troops quickly reached the Rhine. This turned the flank of the German position in the Vosges Mountains and forced a general withdrawal. We were disposed along a line which, beginning in the north on the banks of the Rhine, stretched 500 miles southward to the border of Switzerland. All our divisions were short in infantry replacements, and in total numerical strength of ground forces, the Germans still had a marked advantage. We could, on the average, deploy less than one division to each 10 miles of front. By October 1st, our aggregate strength on the continent was 54 divisions. As a result of the junction with Patch's 7th Army, a considerable number of Germans were trapped in southwestern France. These began to give themselves up by driblets, except in one instance when 20,000 Germans surrendered in a single body.
At Beaugency on September 17th, Nazi General Erich Elster had surrendered 20,000 German troops under his command, marking the end of the Nazi Army of Occupation in southern France. The mass surrender was made without the loss of a single Allied soldier's life. In the north, the Allies decided to drop 3 parachute divisions into German-held Holland in an operation ultimately designed to turn the Nazis' northern flank. The British 1st Airborne Division was to land farthest north, near Arnhem, while the Americans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne were dropping a bit farther south. The operation was regarded as a large gamble, but if the Nazi bridges across the Rhine in the north could be seized, the war might be shortened materially. The drops were executed as planned. The first landings by the main airborne forces were made on September 17th and continued for several days following. Initial losses were slight, but there were some. In 2 weeks, more than 20,000 airborne troops had dropped into Holland. Over 13,000 more landed in gliders, which had been towed across the English Channel.
The attack began well, and unquestionably would have been successful, except for the intervention of bad weather. This prevented the adequate reinforcement of the northern spearhead, and resulted finally in the decimation of the British Airborne Division, and only a partial success in the entire operation.
But the Allied airborne troops in Holland accomplished one important task. Of the bridges to be seized, one of the most vital was the Nijmegen Bridge over the Waal, a branch of the Rhine. British and American troops surprised the Nazi force guarding the bridge and captured the valuable prize before the defenders had a chance to set off the demolitions already prepared. Allied ground forces moved safely across and continued the attack.
During the fall months, there was, as originally planned, much to be done operationally. In the north, besides capturing the approaches to Antwerp, it was desirable to make progress toward closing the Rhine, because it was from this region that our heaviest attacks would be launched in the crossing of that river. Winter conditions were now approaching, and Montgomery's advances were made over difficult country. Because of the extended front held by Montgomery's 21st Army Group, it was impossible at the moment to launch further strong offensives in that area.
To the south of the British forces, the Americans also ran into trouble.
The American First Army got involved in the Hurtgen Forest, the scene of one of the most bitterly contested battles of the entire campaign. The enemy had all the advantages of strong defensive country. The weather was abominable, and the German garrison was particularly stubborn.
From now on, the Allies would continue to advance. All along the outer rim of the Allied bridgehead, bitter fighting went on. Flails were beating paths through the hidden minefields. And behind the shelling came soldiers in twos and threes, in platoons and companies, plodding forward in battalions, making prisoners here, going forward again. Taking more prisoners. Street fighting, taking a village, rounding up more prisoners. Going forward in brigades, becoming divisions, and part of something immeasurable, the offensive. As the Germans retreated, left behind them chaos and ruin. To speed the advance, Allied soldiers, with the help of French civilians, began to repair the broken railway lines. Sappers began to clear streets of wrecked villages and towns. The Allies tried to restore life as quickly as possible to all those communities which had suffered in the battle. At the same time, they set out remaking the shell-pitted roads to speed supplies to the front. And they laid down airstrips in the infield to provide Allied soldiers with fighter cover and protection. June the 12th, June the 13th, British and Canadian troops began to push a wedged salient eastward toward Caen. German resistance was growing stiffer. It was in this area that the German commander hoped to wear down the British armor. This calculation gave the Americans their choice. August 16th, June 17th. The plan that General Blee had drawn up on his map, being fought out in the fields and villages. June the 18th, the American Bonneville, the peninsula cut in two. The second thrust was also going well. By June the 24th, General Bradley and his men were on the outskirts of the city of Cherbourg. By June the 25th, they were fighting in the streets, and every corner was a German tank. And in every house there were German snipers. The enemy commander had given his word that the city would be defended to the last man and the last bullet. But like Field Marshal Paulus at Stalingrad, von Schlieben preferred to keep his rather than his word. He surrendered, and where he led them, his troops followed. On June the 26th, Cherbourg was set free. Cherbourg, second only to Marseille as a port. Mr. Churchill visited the city soon after its liberation. He inspected the launching sites the Germans had erected there for their secret weapons against England. One of the last acts of the German garrison had been to destroy the harbour installations of Cherbourg, so as to deny them to the Allies. The Germans knew that the Allies must have use of a first-class port to bring ashore all the tanks, the lorries and guns, ammunition and stores modern army needs. The Allies, therefore, began to repair the wrecked wharves with great determination. For this important, French workers volunteered at once. The Germans knew that if they could prevent the Allies from seizing and putting into working order any great port, they could defeat the invasion. But the Allies had foreseen this. They had constructed floating harbours in England, and they towed them across the channel in sections. The huge concrete piers were sunk in position to form a breakwater, and more than 60 ships were sunk in line to make an outer wall. Great floating piers and walls that rose and fell with the tide were set up. Soon, lorries and tanks were rolling down toward the beaches in ever greater numbers. Out at the front, every vehicle was needed desperately, urgently, immediately. Behind the lines in Cherbourg, life was slowly going back to normal. There was food again in the marketplace, and gossip and argument about the latest news. There were newspapers again, written and printed by Frenchmen who again were free. And moreover, for the first time in 4 years, French men and women were free to celebrate the 14th July. Old soldiers of the last war saw American soldiers and French sailors marching shoulder to shoulder in this, a symbol of the friendship between the United Nations that must continue when peace comes. While the men of General Bradley's armies were clearing the tip of the Cherbourg Peninsula, British and Canadian troops of the Second Army began a great offensive on the eastern flank of the bridgehead. It was in the area of Caen. The conception that land on the beaches and get a little bridgehead and then dig in, this is no good, General Montgomery in his order of the day. You must penetrate deeply and quickly. On the 25th June, therefore, the British attacked to the east of Tilly-sur-Seine. They succeeded in crossing the railway between Caen and Villers-Bocage at Moor. By the 27th of June, they had crossed the river Odon and made secure their bridgehead on the other side. The next week, the Germans counterattacked with great violence. No less than 7 panzer divisions, including an elite panzer corps transferred to the Russian front, were ranged against the British and Canadians on this narrow sector. Here was the real center of the German strategic dispositions. As the struggle grew fiercer, British bombers came over to scatter and break the German tanks. After the bombardment, the Canadians went forward again. Then they came within sight of Caen itself. Although it had now begun to rain heavily, so that the free movement of the troops was impeded, the advance went on. Bulldozers shipped the mud from the road face. The 8th of July, there was street fighting in Caen. And on the 9th, Caen was set free. The goal General Montgomery had set his men had been won. An ancient mill had been freed, and a great port of France. In the course of the fighting, a great part of the city of Caen had been destroyed. Many homes had been burned and gutted by the unaccountable fury of the battle. Those citizens who had sought refuge in the nearby villages now began to return to what was left of their city. Others had found sanctuary in the cathedral. Men and women of the resistance movement saw to it that food and shelter were provided. One thing was now certain. The Germans had been driven out, and the French resistance fighters, together with the British and Canadians, would make sure that the Germans would never return. But only the enemy was massing for a counter. Again and again they themselves against the British positions. By July the 18th, General Dempsey's troops were on the move again. On a heavy barrage, they went forward. They attacked with flamethrowers of the latest type. Bridgeheads were made secure over the Orne as far as Caen. The meaning of these attacks was made clear by Mr. Simpson, the United States Secretary of War. He said that the British and Canadians had so engaged the enemy that Rommel had no uncommitted strength with which to threaten the American corridor. As the Second Army drove the Germans back in the Caen sector, the Germans launched their flying bombs against the villages of southern England, above all against London. These robots, the Nazis promised the German people, would break the will to fight of the men and women of Britain. The flying bombs destroyed 23,000 homes and damaged 1 million more. But in 1940, the people of London resolved not to give in. Mothers and children were saved of the flying bombs. Special defenses were set up in southern England. Heavy bombers blasted the launching sites along with the Calais. Anti-aircraft batteries shot down robots by the hundreds. Tempest fighters demolished them. The Germans had hoped to lure the Allies into diverting troops for an attack on the heavily fortified coastline part of Calais in order to destroy the flying bomb bays. But the Allied commanders stuck to their own land. Even though they hated the robot bombs and were frightened of them, the people of London hung on. More than 5,000 people were killed by the bombs, and more than 16,000 were wounded during the 80 days of terror. The Allied advance in Normandy on rapidly and ruthlessly. British soldiers fought more fiercely than ever to end this new threat to their wives and children at home. Once more the Germans were beaten by the courage of ordinary men. Depuis July the 9th, the same day British and Canadians had freed Caen, they entered the town. Within the next week, they overcame stubborn German. By this time, there were signs the German commander was no longer master of his own decisions. Even so, the Germans fought with the courage of despair. Casualties were heavy on both sides. Nevertheless, the Americans battered their way through to Saint-Lô by July 16th. Before the town was finally taken, there was heavy fighting. Thanks to the FFR, the Americans were soon able to hunt down the German snipers. The people sit and wait. Many of the old ones have sons in hands. There now developed a battle unique in history, for the Allied commanders decided not to detach any tank of General Patton's army to deal with the German counterattack, but to destroy it with rocket-firing typhoons. It was a battle between tanks and planes. On this day alone, our typhoons destroyed over 80 German tanks. After 2 days of battle, the Germans withdrew on August the 9th. Next, the Canadians pushed down the Falaise. Hundreds upon hundreds of tanks moved up to the attack. Simultaneously, the Americans forged ahead from Alençon, while the Belgians with the Dutch closed in. Together with the fighting French, Poles and the Americans sprang a trap on the 19th of August. Back in Normandy, the Allies continued without pause. American forces Orléans, 74 kilometers Paris. From Orléans, they drove southeast toward the Seine, crossed it above Paris in the neighborhood of Melun. It was this crossing which, together with a British bridgehead north of Paris at Mons, made the capital untenable for the Germans. They were now forced to withdraw all along the front.
By the summer of 1944, the Allies had gained firm footholds in France, in Normandy and in the south. In the east, the Red Army had reached Poland and stood along the eastern foothills of the Carpathians. In Italy, the Allies were advancing towards the River Po. In France, our pursuit of the Germans was slowed down by the supply problem. We had only 2 supply ports, Cherbourg and the Mulberry, the prefabricated harbor at Aramon. The Allied commanders decided, first, to go all out for a big supply port. The British Second Army were to drive through northwest France and Belgium to Antwerp, second port of Europe. The second part of the plan fell to the Third United States Army. They were to race for the Moselle Valley, one of the historical invasion routes into Germany. Third, the plan provided for a drive to the Ruhr, center of German armament production. This was to be carried out by the United States First Army. Fourth, the Allies planned to strike from the south for another gateway to Germany, the Belfort Gap. The United States Seventh Army and the French First Army were given this task. Fifth, to ease the Allied supply problem, the Canadian First Army was to clear the German garrisons from the Channel ports. Eisenhower planned a continuous front along the western border of Germany. Let's see how the plan worked out. At Mons, the British Second Army made for the Somme, through Beauvais, Amiens, and Arras. the British units kept the Germans moving in order to prevent them from making a stand, either in hedgehog groups or along the Somme. Speeding ahead at a rate of more than 60 miles a day, British spearheads, the 11th Armoured Division and the Guards Armoured Division, crossed in Belgium by September the 2nd. Next day they entered Brussels. The citizens of Brussels greeted the British and Belgian troops with tremendous enthusiasm. They had not dared to hope that they could come so soon. The British had come 430 miles in 9 days. It was the same at Antwerp, 23 miles further on, which the British reached next day. They captured the port of Antwerp intact. This success was made possible by the White Army of the Belgian partisans. But the Allies could not use the port of Antwerp yet. Many Germans were still hiding in the sea, and strong forces were entrenched on the islands commanding the entrance to the harbor, Walcheren and Beveland. Beyond Antwerp, the British advance continued into Holland across the Albert Canal. But already, the enormous difficulties of supply were slowing down the advance more and more. The American Third Army, which had been held up for some time in the Paris area, 200 miles southwest from the British, began to move again. Sailing out between the rivers Seine and Marne, they captured Troyes-Longwy by August the 28th. Next day, they crossed the Marne near Château-Thierry, scene of an American victory in 1918. The main direction of the Third Army's front was now clear. Patton's army raced for Verdun and the Moselle Valley, natural gap in Germany's strategic front. Often driving 100 miles ahead of the main body of the army, these tanks passed through Verdun and by September the 2nd succeeded in establishing bridgeheads across the Moselle between the forts of Nancy and Metz. But once more, the tanks had outpaced the supply column. There was no more petrol. The great army of 200,000 men came to a halt a day's march from their goal.
Meanwhile, the American Third and First Army had struck farther south. Rundstedt attempted to retreat across the Rhine, but in the confusion, one vital bridge was left intact, the bridge at Remagen.